Thanks so much, Robin, and thanks so much, Aurelio. I don't see the presentation. There it goes. Yeah, thanks to my colleagues, and also thanks to all the participants who have kept focused during an information-heavy series of presentations. I hope to capture your attention for just a few more minutes. I know that my colleagues have given you excellent context for the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework, but I'd like to do it again. Just want to zoom out for a second and really give you kind of the bird's eye view of how all these things fit together to really point out that there's a lot of opportunities for how the work on the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework can feed into the process. But it's a lot of work, as you can see from this super simple graphic. So we're kind of starting on the right here. You see the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework is really the monitoring implementation tool to track progress of this, of course, through the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plans, which is really the national level unit through which the Global Biodiversity Framework is implemented. So this Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework will then be used for the national reviews, which will happen in 2026 and 2029. All of this information, the CBD encourages nations to constantly be updating their national biodiversity strategic action plans. So that's a really big opportunity for us. If we can provide good data over time, that means that improved plans over the years can continue to come through. The monitoring framework will also be used for the yearly review of communal progress and the larger reviews of communal progress, which will happen at COP17 and COP19, both of these happening through the subsidiary body on implementation, which will be fed through with advice from the subsidiary body on scientific and technical and technological advice, which of course is what we as COP4CBD are hoping to inform ourselves. In addition to us and the SBSTTA, we also have the online discussion forum and the ad hoc technical experts groups, as well as the informal advisory groups that are all feeding into this Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework development. So as you can see, lots of opportunity. It can really influence the way that we talk, track, and update plans in accordance with the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it's a lot of work with a lot of moving parts. So just kind of wanted to draw attention to that. You can move to the next slide, Robin. So I am really pleased that previous colleagues in previous presentations kind of already brought this level of analysis to the conversation. But I think as scientists, we're often kind of siloed or limited to thinking about really just the technical portions. That's kind of the middle circle here. Which is like what is being measured, what's included, what is missing. This is kind of the technical information on the indicators themselves. But I think just as important is also thinking about these kind of political and social contexts within which our science is existing. So this on the left is kind of who is measuring, who has a seat at the table, and also on the right for whom are these indicators made for and in pursuit of what goals. And so I think placing our science into this context is really important. And I hope to touch on all three of these kind of circles. So you can move forward now, Robin. Just a note on kind of these auxiliary bodies to the Global Biodiversity Framework, that monitoring framework that I mentioned. You have the ad hoc technical expert group, which will, as I mentioned, kind of do the metadata of existing indicators and work on methodological recommendations. So this is touching on all the stuff that Arildo just walked us through. And then in addition to the stuff that you see here, you have, well, of course, the SBSTTA 25th meeting, which is what we're working towards. You also have private groups. So you have things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which are working on indicators in conjunction with this. You have the online discussion forum. So again, just to point out that there are lots of bodies and processes that are feeding into this development of indicators and this discussion on how we track progress. And you can move on to the next slide, Robin. So on that point on what is being measured, there are a few kind of main issues that I'd like to highlight briefly. So I kind of the lowest hanging fruit here is the gaps in the current headline indicator and those that don't have an existing methodology. So this is what Arildo talked about a bit. There are quite a few headline indicators that are really supposed to be the kind of the main substance of the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework that still don't have an accepted methodology. So this is obviously a huge opportunity, but a lot of work. The aggregation and disaggregation of the headline indicators, incredibly important. There is a ton of research on the fact that when you leave out disaggregated data for specific groups, so either whether it's women, whether it's children, whether it's indigenous people, rural versus urban populations, including this information is incredibly important for designing good policy. And ignoring and not including that information can lead us to do more harm than good. The gaps to operationalize management. So this is kind of how these things are going to be monitored. So we need to make sure that we're building capacity, providing those that don't have the capacity with the tools, technology, and support to do so, to make sure that we don't have continued data gaps as we see now in science. So that's everything from finance to technology transfer. And also I would point out that we need to, and this is continues to be a big challenge in kind of global environmental governance, is we really need to get over this kind of competitive hegemony that current nation states kind of operate in when working on these global kind of negotiations, and moving that towards a cooperative model. Also a clear guidance on how the parties will use these indicators, what they will be used for. There's a big discussion on the role and the inclusion of binary indicators, how these will factor in, what level of importance they might give, how we can translate those to quantitative kind of numbers, and then the ability for non-experts to contribute. As I pointed out 2 slides ago, this is an incredibly complex process with incredibly complex documentation. Even for us scientists, it's taking us hours to kind of get through this documentation. So, how non-experts, indigenous people, local communities, local knowledge, how all of these things feed into this process and whether they are able to have a seat at the table will be incredibly important for the success and the take-up of this monitoring framework. Next slide, please. So now I just want to touch on for whom are these indicators made for in pursuit of kind of what goals. So I'll start by saying that the indicators chosen will really influence the political decision-making and discourse around global biodiversity efforts, really. And you see this already in the Sustainable Development Goals. So for example, you have Target 15. If people have read the Global Biodiversity Framework, there is a very careful choice of words here that is very much on the positive aspects of things, so enabling and cooperating with private industry. So the philosophy that the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework and the Global Biodiversity Framework has in relation to how we're either limiting or cooperating with private industry, just to give an example of how the kind of dynamics of these indicators really shape global discourse. Similarly, we have a target in the GBF for sustainable consumption, and yet the only indicator attached to the sustainable consumption is to limit food waste, which is obviously not something we would think of as the only aspect of sustainable consumption. Even after we get through designing good goals that are in line with the targets of the GBF and aligning those targets with kind of global ambition, we have the design of these indicators and how to properly measure them, which is a huge challenge. And doing so improperly can really propose real big problems for misaligning incentives. So for example, I think a good example is the EU Commission recently recommended the measuring of cultural value from protected parks as the number of overnight stays in hotels, hostels, there to encourage more tourism near national parks rather than properly capturing the cultural values of those wild spaces. We kind of have this on the right now, this constant debate of development versus environmental protection, which is really fueled by a lack of capacity building from global north to global south. For example, in the UNFCCC on the climate change side of things, global north countries are still failing to meet their financial commitments to the global south, which leaves developing countries in this really awkward situation of trying to decide between development and environmental protection, which is not something we want to be placing these countries in. We have the challenge of implementation at the national level, which will require your expertise. And touching on this point that I have just previously mentioned, getting non-experts to, or a range of experts even, to input into this process is really important. COP4 CBD is a great example of how we might bridge those gaps. And then finally, on the next slide, just want to touch on like who has a seat at the table. So again, coming straight back to this point, the difficulty of interpreting these documents and interpreting the structure and knowing how to even engage with this process is a clear power imbalance throughout the CBGBF and the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Framework. There are all these calls to emphasize the fact that the CBD really invites anyone and everyone to kind of input into this process. But again, the hurdles, both technical and knowledge hurdles of getting involved in the process, means that that open call to businesses and indigenous people really favors those who have the capacity. So let's say global developed countries or private industry, rather than average citizens or indigenous people in local communities. So something to keep in mind. The inclusion of mechanisms that currently depend on financial landscapes, especially in regards to monitoring and how to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework, really perpetuate the power imbalances that currently exist within those systems. So I think Marie touched on this in the previous presentation, kind of identifying them as false solutions. And also just who has the power to steer these conversations, these developments, these global indicators, these discussions, is really something we have to keep in mind, right? Even something as simple as the USA not being on the Convention of Biological Diversity, that is a large aspect of how important this convention and the framework is perceived, and kind of how serious global diplomacy kind of takes these issues. So who is signing, who is not, who's engaged in the negotiations, how much political power do they have to leverage, what's being included? These are all really important aspects to consider when we now look at the indicators that we're choosing to monitor those targets that have been established through that kind of political power engagement. So I hope that was somewhat helpful, and I think our presentation ends here. So I think we open for questions now, but thank you for your continued attention.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. So as you said, it is now open for discussion, so feel free to ask your question by raising hand. Thomas?
Hello, thank you. Tom Harwood, currently at the University of Oxford. I've been generating a number of indicators, and I guess we tend to generate them at national scale. So my interest here is in how we actually get the input data for the indicators. So something like the World Database of Protected Areas is a sort of agreed where the protected areas are, and people can contribute their national data to that, and they can use their own definitions of what they think are actually protected areas. When it comes to land use and land cover and the sort of extent of degradation, which feeds into a lot of the other indicators of the state of biodiversity, there isn't an agreed sort of state of the world, and no mechanism for nations to feed their data into any of these sort of top-down global calculations. So it'd be really good to have a mechanism to sort of aggregate that world view for the input data before anyone starts, building their stuff on top of it. If that makes sense.
Rildo or Giacomo, feel free to be back.
Yeah, I mean, I think great points. I don't know if you wanted us to respond to that. I think this is kind of a little bit the point that we tried to bring up, that choosing these indicators and working with the current landscape of the data that exists and trying to patch those data gaps, and then acknowledging and working from the basis that because of what currently exists, and that is definitely going to feed into the discourse on what will be used in the future. As you point out, kind of these these global data sets and how those might be used to develop those indicators, and whether we're happy with whether those indicators track the progress on those targets. So I think that kind of that process of deliberation and decision making is really important. I'm not sure if you wanted us to expand, but I think it's great points.
No, thanks. That's great. I'll just be really keen to know if there's a plan to get a mechanism to suck up national data on their view of the level of degradation and the state of that. Just collect the data, which is then taken forward to some of the other indicators would be useful. But yeah, there's one.
Yeah, I don't know if you have something to add, Aurelio, but from my point of view, that's kind of why we're here, right? Like those precise discussions, that process of finding out what is most applicable to those discourses is kind of, as far as I interpret it, kind of our role or part of our role. As I pointed out, lots of different bodies and kind of organizations feeding into this process, but for sure something that we hope to work on, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think I have a question from Quentin next, but just before I can respond to one of the questions of the chat, which is on what is a binary indicator. So a binary indicator is just a response to a question. It was on one of the slides, but maybe in small. It's a question that you can answer by yes, no, rather yes, rather no, this kind of, for example, or on did you establish an access and benefit sharing system in your country? Yes, no, partly. This is the kind of indicators that binary indicators are. Yes, continue, please.
Yeah, great. It was me ignorant about what binary indicator was. My question is a bit similar to Thomas's as well. Looking through the 26, you can see a whole bunch of different sectors in there. Many of the indicators are not about biodiversity itself. It's about economics and trade and particular sectors such as fishing and things like this. That's an enormous big stakeholder group to get data from. How is that addressed?
Again, I really want to jump in. I'm happy to take a back seat, but I can also contribute some thoughts. I don't want to take up more space than I deserve. So, Aurelio, go ahead if you have something to say. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's good you compliment Giacomo, but I just want to highlight that based on what your question, I think something that is quite important is that most of some of this data, I think, is they are quite related to some companies or the private sector. So I think a sort of important point is to consider also how we can engage with these different actors in order to also bring this kind of data, especially for the economic accounting when you mention. So there are, of course, a lot of issues about the confidentiality of this data and this kind of things, but I think as far as I see, the important step is really try to open and strengthen more this conversation with these actors in order that we can somehow bring this data to be able to use to help to monitor these aspects, as you mentioned, Quentin, for the framework. But I think Giacomo can also complement more.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think a couple things here. I think I definitely agree with Aurelio. There's a real need to strengthen the transparency and the data that we're getting from the whole range of actors in the space. This definitely includes, all the range of private entities that work on biodiversity, which I would argue are all of them. And there are certainly bodies that are working towards this end. So you have things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. You have the Science-Based Target Initiative for Nature. You have kind of all of these methodologies that hope to bring biodiversity reporting, data collection to wider ranges, not just of the political sphere, but of the private sphere. On the other hand, as Thomas points out, the choice of indicators towards this and what's included and the amount of data that we're expecting from certain entities within the framework is really shaping again, political discourse. And so, you know, as you point out, Quentin, you have this large amount of representation of what really amounts to like private impact or private progress on biodiversity. And at the same time, you have indicators, as Thomas points out, that don't even really get to the point of degradation. You know, I think of target 1 here, and we have kind of all of these proxies for degradation, kind of, you know, how much land use change, how much protected areas, but not necessarily direct indicators. And so again, I think it's just really important to keep in mind, you know, of course, we should go out and get this data. This is really important. We should encourage transparency along all aspects of society. But it's really important to think about what additional indicators we can add into this to make sure that we're allowing a proper representation of kind of all spheres of impact on biodiversity. That would be my take. But
yeah, I just wanted to complement a little bit about this this part as well. That's something that I remember this, that I think also we need to think that we will need to also put a lot of effort towards, because I think it's not only about to collect more data, but also to work in terms of to make more clear these links in terms of attribution, which is one of the aspects that it's very important for when we think in terms of these indicators. As Giacomo just mentioned, and Thomas as well, some of these indicators, there are actually proxies for something that we want to understand how exactly is working. But I think to work more towards to really make more clear this link and to be able to attribute cause and effect is also something that's very important to consider, to work on it as well, I think, yeah.
Question from Audrey?
Yes, in fact, well, my question is a follow-up on that from Thomas, I think. In fact, I was wondering if there was any indicator giving an idea on how you aggregate or disaggregate the indicators and how to go from the local to the global scale. And it was linked to connectivity. So I was thinking like, okay, we might have indicators about how degraded it is somewhere, or what is the good state of one protected area, but the linkage with the other places. And also I put it in the chat. I was wondering if there were any indicators of the land-ocean connectivity, because sometimes they are treated separately and I think they shouldn't. So do you have any info to share about that, or is it missing, or?
I can start, and then Aurelio, you can complement as needed. On the second part, I honestly couldn't tell you, Danan. There's a long list of, certainly in the headline indicators, I didn't see anything related, but they may be in the complementary indicators, and that's a quite extensive list. But I see Thomas shaking his head, so maybe not. And on the first part about the disaggregation of the data, I think this is really going to be one of the main issues that we work on going forward. I think a lot of it has to do on what we require and what we don't. We know, I think, I'm American. I know this from public data collection in my own country, but when it's not required, people don't do it. And so you have this huge data gap for example, women in public health in America and crime prevention, this sort of thing. I imagine much the same thing. And certainly on the data that I've worked from on the SDGs, it's very similar. Those indicators that don't require disaggregation for rural versus urban or whatever other disaggregation may be useful, it's simply not collected. And so I think an important aspect of this will just be requiring, similarly as the headline indicators are required to be reported on, requiring that disaggregation so that it's not a lack of political ambition that comes down to whether we have that data or not. That would be my response.
Because I think it's really key here. That's something very important if we want to give, really to protect anything. We need to know what we do somewhere, the implication for the other places, so we can have a global framework with people working at different scales, but in harmony or somehow. And that will require this kind of indicator of connectedness between places or population.
Absolutely, and this again goes back to the point on like how political discourse is shaped by these targets. I mean, national
It's gone,
strategic,
right?
yeah, it's a national level thing, right? And we all know that ecosystems are not separated by national boundaries; they're separated by ecoregions, by geographical and you know, Earth systems. And so, you know, finding ways to collaborate beyond national boundaries, beyond the nation state, that's going to be really important, I think. And so again, just to say, you know, it seems all very technical and objective, but actually there is quite a lot of political implication for how we measure, the unit upon which we measure, the political jurisdiction upon which that is measured, and how that feeds back to each other. So I think it's a great point really to keep in mind.
Thank you, Giacomo.
Thank you.
We have after Guido, then Alice, and then Mattia.
Thanks. Guido Brucko from WWF. Thanks for a really great set of presentations on the monitoring framework. I see that we're losing a few people. I can't understand why, because I think it's a really important and interesting subject. But particularly useful to start with sort of a reminder of what were the weaknesses of the Aichi targets framework. And obviously we have made a great step forward in terms of having actually a monitoring framework with a set of agreed indicators, including headline indicators, right at the beginning of the implementation of the GBF. In terms of gaps, I think a number of sort of statements have been made already, but I'd like to hone in on two specific gaps that are really worrying for us. One is on the drivers and the indirect drivers. And it's true that there's a number of indicators identified in the framework, but not as headline indicators. And headline indicators are the ones that the governments will be focusing on. That's the ones that they're expected to monitor. So I think that's really an important area where more work needs to be done. And the other one is the human rights-based approach and whole of society approaches. A great set of principles in section C, a number of very good references in the targets, but not yet in the indicators. And it means if you don't, if you're not asked to monitor it, then it's also very easy to forget to implement them. Now then, how to address those? The RTEC has been tasked to address the gaps in the indicators. Now, it seems that it is focusing currently on developing the methodology for the indicators, the headline indicators that have been identified already. That means that it leaves the gap of those targets that don't have adequate headline indicators already. And we really believe that they should get urgent attention as well in the RTEC and subsequent work to really get a comprehensive set of headline indicators. I'd be interested to hear the views of the speakers about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comment and this important issue on the table. Guido, Giacomo.
I agree. I think these are very important issues and topics that we will need to develop more work. But something that I think it's also particularly important for this aspect is also to consider that I think we need to put also a lot of effort towards in terms of the capacity building, transfer of technology, because most of the time I think we have a sort of more biased view in terms of when we consider, for example, Europe or other developed countries that have this kind of infrastructure. It means more available. And but I believe, especially as the main goal of the framework is to have this kind of global dashboard that we can really assess this globally. I think this is something that we should particularly focus in thinking ways to do that and collaborate, because I think for these points you mentioned, I think one of the main limitations currently, I think, is related to this. And probably we also didn't do very well in terms of this, considering the Aichi targets. So I think now it's an important moment as well to really consider this at the light also of the discussions of the climate change and these other aspects. Yeah, but I believe Giacomo can also talk.
Could I just ask you for a little bit of clarification? But just first to say that I completely agree with my colleague Arildo, but as I understood it, so you're saying that there's a worry about the lack of headline indicators that include data that would track the direct and indirect drivers of land use change and biodiversity loss. Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, more specifically, target 10, for example, doesn't cover indicators related to overconsumption and these sorts of things. Target 14, target 16, they don't have headline indicators. They're key targets for the drivers.
Yeah, no, and again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, this really comes back to, who has the political influence to drive what the indicators are chosen for, and even more broadly, like what targets are we aiming for? And I think here is kind of where we have to be a little bit sneaky, and maybe this is not maybe it's a little bit taboo to say, but maybe we as scientists, and especially within this body, don't have the political clout to influence the decision making on what targets are being chosen. But we can kind of be sneaky, right? As you say, there's not yet headline indicators or methodologies established for some of these things. A lot of these things are kind of proxies as we've seen, and so we can kind of be sneaky about what data we recommend to be included, arguing that they're important for the tracking of these targets. And so I think that's kind of a way that we can influence, as you say, kind of the tracking and reporting on these sorts of things. If we argue that the tracking of the direct and indirect land use pressures are really important, we can campaign for the inclusion of those things within the monitoring framework. Similarly, as I pointed out, I couldn't agree more. There's the target on sustainable consumption, which only identifies reducing food waste by 30%, which of course is not the only thing that we would think of as sustainable consumption. And so I think being kind of clever and strategic with the indicators that we recommend being included and the data that we recommend being tracked for the indicators, I think is really important, and maybe kind of a sly way to get our scientific selves into the political decision making of it all.
Right, thanks for the discussion.
Yeah, maybe I can just give a compliment on the political aspect of the discussion on this, is that some countries don't want also to have this kind of constraint. And sorry, I have to get. I will respond later. Please proceed. I think there is a question from Timo. Sorry. Alice.
Hi all, some really interesting talks. So I just came from the IPBES meeting, and what was very clear in both IPBES and the COP at the end of last year is, as you've noted, the reason that headline indicators are selected is often because of the political background. What we saw in both the meetings is there's a clear lack of comprehension by many of the parties as to what these indicators entail. And so rather than choosing the best indicator, they'll often choose one that they find is the easiest or the most feasible. That means for some, we have the red list, where for most species, we won't have a single data point before this framework ends. Or for sustainable wildlife trade, we only have fish stocks and we don't have any monitoring for any others. I think something we need to think about very clearly is how we do better in 2030 when we will see the post-2030 action agenda. And so from what you've seen and what you've discussed, how do you think we could work better with parties so that we can advocate for better indicators next time? Because if we don't, we are going to face another situation where we're likely to once again have inadequate indicators. Thank you.
I would just, I think harking back to my previous point, I think just because the indicators and targets may have been already decided at the previous conferences for the post 2020 GBF, I don't think that stops us there. I think there's more work to be done. I think we can be strategic about the data that we campaign to be collected for and the influence that we'll have on the discussions. But at the same time, I think, and I as someone who has worked in academia and is currently an academic scientist, with my purview very much on publishing and being scientific, I do think that there's real space for scientific experts, professionals, and just people who work in the space with knowledge to really contribute more directly to these negotiations. I see that as a real weakness of the current negotiation structure, and in general, policymaking, even on the national scale. So I think definitely, and this is really difficult, but campaigning for the introduction of spaces that allow that to happen. I mean, COP for CBD is certainly a good example of that. But kind of amplifying those structures that allows that to happen, and taking some responsibility on ourselves. I know as a scientist, it's not something that we're always willing or really used to doing, is taking that political lens and putting that political hat on. But as I said, I'm really encouraged to see the interest and the knowledge that my colleagues in the other presentations, in my own presentations, in the audience have on the topic, and I think that that is really indicative of this change on what we're willing to accept in terms of scientific policy making, and how engaged the scientific community is, so that it's not just a political decision, but rather a political and scientific decision. That's what I would say. Arildo, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with you, Giacomo. And that just to add that, I think the most important aspect, I think, is this kind of engagement and talk, because as you said, especially in academia, we have this kind of different main issues we normally work on, but I think we need to make this kind of effort, because if we don't have a sort of common ground or common language that we can interact with these different actors, I think it's quite difficult to change. For example, as was mentioned in the question, to find these meaningful indicators, and also especially to understand these different realities that each country is facing. So I think this demands a lot of effort from our side to really try to interact and listen to, because especially in academia, we normally have this kind of directions to produce the output more, but not to interact that much. So I think this is quite important as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Arildo. Sorry for but what I was about to say earlier, but was relating to this political issue that scientific community and expertise can contribute to, is the risk for some countries to put some issues outside of the GBF, because they estimate that it's out of the mandate of the convention. For example, some countries on climate change don't want to have too much constraint on this, or for example on health issues, because they consider that it's discussion relating to this issue have to happen in other arenas. But I think for comprehensive and consistent strategy, we have to integrate and link to all these issues, and have also some target and objectives and indicators to follow these other issues, because we know that biodiversity loss is linked to a lot of activities and a lot of domains. So there's also this contribution that the communities, the scientific community can bring to the political. Is cannot do this without these links. I think that could be a message. And then after we have Mattia.
Thanks so much, Robin. Just a couple of things for me. I'm working in WCMC in our policy team as a program officer. And just a couple of points I think we already mentioned. First of is that UNEP WCMC is working with indicator providers, indicator custodians, to prepare the metadata for the headline indicators that have been adopted in the monitoring framework, and I put a link to the chat. And since we are supporting the ACTEC indicators, we tend to update this website before any of the ACTEC indicators meeting. So if you see the metadata for each of the headline indicators, it contains quite a lot of information we mentioned before. So for example, is this a global indicator, national indicator? Is there a global methodology or national methodology? What are the gaps? Also, can the indicator be disaggregated and so level? So this is a really useful resource for everyone to have on the adopted headline indicators. We also tend to provide metadata for component complementary indicators, but as you know, there's quite a lot of them, so it will take some time for that as well. But this site is regularly updated with all the newest information, as I said, in collaboration with indicator providers. Other thing I also wanted to say, we mentioned the question on who are these indicators for, and the question of the national methodologies on the indicators. And I just wanted to say that the headline indicators are not really tended to capture the whole scope of the goals or targets, rather than the essence of the actual wording of the goals and targets. And parties, in addition to headline indicators, are encouraged to also use their own national indicators. So if there's not a headline indicator they want to use or they can use, parties are still encouraged to use their national indicators and report it in their 7th national report. And just the final thing, that the ACTEC indicators, one of the terms of reference on ACTEC indicators is also to review the question on disaggregation and aggregation of the headline indicators. So this is something that will also be discussed, especially, for example, we mentioned headline indicator for target 3 on protected areas. As we know, in the old wording, the wording of the headline indicator had included, for example, the effective management of protected areas, which hasn't been included in this new version. But this is something that doesn't mean it disappeared or it won't be incorporated. It's just something, this is also a term of reference for ACTEC to review all the possible disaggregation of the headline indicators without us expanding the text over half a page. So this is also something that's part of this group. And the I think it was a question about the global binary indicators. So as we said, these are indicators that tend to capture yes and no responses from countries and will also be used in national reporting. But the ACTEC indicators is currently working on the actual questions for the binary indicators. So it wouldn't just be yes or no, and this is the all information we have. So the ACTEC indicators actually agreed to make this more categorical. So we would have, for example, question on LPSCs and inclusion. We will have categories for each, like women, youth, LPSCs, local communities, and it will be more than just yes, no. We will have a group of categorical questions, which aims to then provide more data than just at the end, yes or no. How is this going to be weighed against? What will be categorized as yes, what's a no, we'll see at the end. But the CBD also made a website for the ACTEC indicators, and you can see the documentation for after each of the meeting, what came out of it. And I think there's a plan for the first in-person meeting on ACTEC now in October. So we'll see what happens after that. And after substays, I think there will be a paper presented by the co-chairs on the progress on the ACTEC indicators. That's all for me. Thanks so much, Robin.
You're welcome. Thank you, Nadia. I don't know if speakers have some words to respond, or we can. Yeah, sure. Comment? I think you're frozen. Okay. We are.
Okay.
We are.
Great. So yeah, so sorry if we weren't clear on the binary indicators. Certainly the way that I would think about it is kind of, these classic questions on surveys that are, how do you feel about this? I feel yes, strongly, yes, somewhat, yes, not yes, no, strongly, no, somewhat. And then those are kind of translated into numbers 1 through 7 or something like this. So certainly that's kind of the information on the binary indicators. Thank you for that, Matea. Also, definitely the WCMC great tool. Highly recommend to check it out. Just a quick point on what you said about the headline indicators and what's included and what's not, and the phrasing within the framework. Again, going back to the whole conversation that we've been having, certainly there is space within the framework to give, flexibility in what is being recorded and reported by national plans and countries. But again, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that certainly having something included in the headline indicators, and I think one of the questions or one of the participants in this meeting kind of asked a question to that point, is having a headline indicator is certainly not the same as encouraging parties to optionally provide data on another thing, and what is included and what's not is really an important kind of aspect to consider. Similarly, for the wording in these things, certainly it leaves space for the optional reporting and monitoring of some data. But I was also in the room in Montreal when Target 15 was completely removed any hard substantive targets on limiting the impact of business. So certainly these are not only space saving and implied kind of modifications that are being done to these frameworks. There certainly is a power analysis that needs to be incorporated into kind of understanding what's included and what's not. And so just to add that, not that they're mutually exclusive, but just to keep both in mind as we think about what's being recorded, what's not, what's encouraged, what's required. So that's what I would add to the last piece.
Thank you, Giacomo. Yeah. Questions? We have Sunny before and then Shen.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you all for this very interesting discussion. I think most of what I wanted to contribute was already said by Matea, so thank you very much for that. But just to reflect a little bit more on what opportunities are for experts to contribute, I think there are actually more ways than has been discussed so far. It will require some more proactiveness from yourself to, for example, reach out to the national focal point on CBD, to reach out to people that are part of the ATEC. Well, the online forum has already been shown a few minutes ago. So I think there are a lot of options, and in particular, if it's on the online forum, it's visible to anyone and everyone. So I would really recommend you to also make use of that. And though we are really aiming for headline indicators and that those are the more mandatory part of it, I do think that they will in no way really cover everything. So the binary indicators, complementary indicators, component, and also national indicators will remain a very important part of actually tracking where we're at. So I would also say, like in every respective country that you're working with, to really encourage them as well to use as many indicators as possible. I hope that not every country, or that not many countries will only use the headline indicators. So that's more a call from my side, also as CBD focal point, but then in the Netherlands. So I think there are options. At the same time, it would also be good indeed to already think about a post-2030 global biodiversity framework. If we can already, if the scientific community can already come up with ideas on how to have headline indicators at that point in time, because realizing that there won't be enough data so far to really have headline indicators for every single target that we have right now, which is what has also been explained before. I think it would be good to look at the long term, but not forget about the short term opportunities that are there as well. So thanks a lot.
I don't know if Robin and Arildo want to add more. I just asked Robin to bring up a slide on our presentation again. This was kind of my goal with putting on this big messy graphic on the screen, and this was kind of what I was trying to point out, lots of opportunities, certainly not just through COP4CBD, which feeds into the SBSTTA, but also the ad hoc technical groups, that's ATEG, as you pointed out, there's the informal advisory groups, there's the online discussion forum. So there's lots and lots of ways, certainly the national biodiversity strategic action plans as well on the national level, if we're working in the EU as well, also the EU Commission and the legislation and policymaking and reporting that they are doing. So certainly lots and lots of ways to get involved, but certainly something to keep in mind. And just to expand on the headline indicators discussion, I did not mean to kind of indicate that those are the only ones that matter. Certainly, I just think it's important to kind of keep in mind kind of the again, the power structures that inform this global decision making. Certainly, I think that working diligently and carefully on the other indicators is just as important. And again, as you point out, because there's so many ways that we can feed in on a national level, we also have quite some ability to influence what is being recorded, even if it's not mandatorily mandated by the CBD. And so I think they are great points. But just to put this this graph up here one more time for all of the multitudinous ways that we might be involved in the process. But thank you so much for your inputs, Corinne.
Good, Giacomo.
Good.
We'll take the last question from Sean, and then I'll try to give you a few words on the climate change topic. Yes, Sean?
Sorry, Arildo, did you want to add something to that as well, just before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I want, if we have time, Robin. I just.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no problem, sir. No, I just want to really, I mean, I totally agree with that, with what Giacomo just answered. I just want to also think that it's important we consider that about this indicator, the headline, the component, the complementary. Of course, we have this sort of more mandatory, more standard, the headline ones, and countries can use these other ones if they are available. But I think it's important to consider as well how we can make a sort of more coherent understanding of these components, because if you imagine that countries will use different indicators, I think it's important that we try to consider, which has a little bit to do with we discussed at some point in the presentation, with this kind of clear guidance for the countries and the parts how to use. I think consider how, because we see, for example, there are some redundancies between these different groups of indicators. So to think how we can make this more coherent in terms of evaluate it and track progress, I think is also very important to consider for the coming efforts. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Arildo. Sean? Yes.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Giacomo. Especially appreciate the slide about identifying who the indicators are for and what they'll be used for. Can you talk a little more about something I thought I heard when I was at COP15, which was a mechanism whereby parties can either peer review each other's reports and provide feedback, and where parties can share lessons learned on reporting the indicators, so that, you know, one party overcomes a certain difficulty, that this can be shared with peers, and so that there can be just more effective implementation across the globe.
I have to say that I'm not super familiar, so I don't have a great answer on this. I don't know if Arildo or Robin, you have more information, but I didn't manage to get into the specifics on how that might happen.
I've heard some things on this, but I'm not especially neither. But big and not at the foundation, there's an institute that work on this. If you want, Sean, I can make you contact with this person. Some question, but actually the mechanism for planning and reporting is addressed by another agenda item, that's SBSTTA-25, and That's why we didn't address it here, because we lack some skills, I think, on this very Christian, and also have some very political issues regarding the mandatory aspect, the reviewing process, and the comment that came out from this reviewing process. So I think there are still questions on this. The agenda items on this, with the annotated agenda items, which is now available. And there is also the discussion that will be at the SBI level. So other arenas and other spaces to speak on this, but today we were only focused on the monitoring framework. I know this is linked, but so much aspects on this question that we didn't address today, but still it's important. Yes, sure.
No problem, thanks. Just highlighting the connection to that point by Giacomo, that there are many uses to the indicators beyond reporting. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelio. Thank you, Giacomo. Yeah, Giacomo.
No, I meant to put a thumbs up to just emphasize that I really appreciate the input. I didn't mean to raise my hand, but thank you certainly. And as we said, this is kind of the general overview first training, but I certainly think that diving into these details will be super important as we get into kind of the technical work. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. So unfortunately, as I said before, our speaker for climate change couldn't find this presentation, but on this topic, we won't deplete this topic from our activities, and it will be addressed during our next workshop in 18 and 19 of September. But may, for the people who attend this training session for this very topic, I can still say a few words, but I'm not a specialist, and it will be only on Substa and CBD aspects. I can share my screen to show some of the main documents. So this is the page of the website of the CBD, where we can find all the documents that has been agreed during COP15. And so already discussed on it. We have this decision with 15.5, which contain the monitoring framework. So, and the target in the decision 15/4. So these are the goals and targets, and these are the indicators. So for the climate change, we have one target dedicated, which deals with minimizing the impact of climate change, and so acidification of biodiversity, increase its resilience through mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction actions, including the nature-based solution and or ecosystem-based approaches, while minimizing negative and fostering of climate action on biodiversity. So this is the agreed target that came out from COP15 on climate change. It's under goal B, which is on on goal A, which is on the conservation and the pressure and the driver of biodiversity loss. So climate change is one of them. We have these indicators associated. So first column is about the headline indicator, and there is no headline yet. But we have some proposition of component or complementary indicator. Here they are, but it's not a mandatory, so it's something that can be adopted at national scales by parties. So this is what came out of the COP15 on the climate change aspect regarding the biodiversity framework. And for SBSTTA-25 in October, the climate change at the agenda, we have annotated provisional agenda, which says on biodiversity and climate change, that the conference, so the COP requested the SBSTTA to work further on reviewing this item with so the parties were asked after COP15 to give some element back to the Secretariat on climate change. So the Secretariat made a compilation of these statements, and then it said that the SBSTTA will dispose this document to discuss on this, and also the SBSTTA is invited to review this information contained in the notes and prepare conclusion and recommendation for the COP16. What is about to happen during SBSTTA-25 on biodiversity and climate change? So this is the stated agenda. So and we also have document which is this one. So it's the SBSTTA-25-12 is here. So there's this overview of the statement of the parties on climate change. So this is a compilation. So it deals with IPBES and IPCCs, between biodiversity and climate change, sources of information and metrics to follow this, the links to the Kunming Memorial GB. Some aspect also on nature-based solution and ecosystem-based approaches, which is the COP. The synergies with other conventions, integration of climate change into policies, the principle, the inclusion of indigenous people and local communities and stakeholders, etc. So part on the Kunming Memorial Probability Framework. I think what is important is this page, which contains the proposed recommendation that could come out of the SBSTTA-25, which say that the SBSTTA is to adopt a recommendation and recommends that the parties, the conference of parties, this is the CBD document, and it's a bit tricky. So at the end of SBSTTA-25, the SBSTTA may recommend to the conference of parties at its 16th meeting to ask, to urge the parties to implement target 8, so to identify and maximize potential synergies, etc., integrate nature-based solutions. So it's a SBSTTA that calls the COP to urge the parties to do something if you want to have a complete understanding of what's going to happen. So there are some details. I won't go further into it because, as I said, I'm not a specialist, but it was to give you a global overview. This, but as I said earlier, we still to address this topic during our next stage of the sequence I presented earlier. So sorry if you have questions, but I think as I think we are going to just go into the conclusion of the meeting. So my screen. So before entering into this slide, I just want to thank a lot the speakers that presented today, because short notice, it's not simple topics. So it's very, the project is very grateful to experts. So thank you again. And for the follow-up of the training session, so there's several aspects. If you want to contribute to COP for CBD action for SBSTTA 25, after this training session, as I said in the introduction, we can create some thematic groups of discussion to help to prepare the next phase of our sequence. I mean, workshop in Paris for the 8th to September. If you want, as here my colleague from the MNHN told you at the beginning of the training session, if you want to be updated and to have a clearer comprehension of CBD processes, please follow COP for CBD website, as there will be a training session to understand more CBD on the 4th of October. And if you want to participate directly to CBD or related activities, there is some link. So there will be a series of webinars on knowledge management for biodiversity. It starts tomorrow and happen every Tuesday for 9 weeks from here to next 9 weeks. So feel free to register and follow this series of webinars. But there's also 2 forums. One on the KMGBF, when you can access direct information on the target and the goals and the indicator, and you can post messages and discuss with other experts. And there is also on another link. So if you are interested in, feel free to go on these links. And if you want to access, I think this presentation will be available at the site of the project. The project is available at www.cop4cbd. I think it's .com or .net, but you will find it on the internet. Yes, I think this is. Yeah, so .eu. So unless some of the speakers have a last word to say, or a colleague from the project, feel free to express. Or if not, it was a pleasure to have you, and please follow our links and the social medias we have, and whenever you have questions, feel free to come back to us, and we'll inform all the people interested for the next phase of the project. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.